We begin our exploration of the first 4 of the 12 attributes, qualities, powers, or virtues. These are all different names Mother has used, which make for an effective and complete manifestation. These first 4, sincerity, humility, gratitude, and perseverance, can be described as the foundation for all growth and evolution. Whether your growth is individual, whether it is a collective, whether it is internal or an external. Any growth, any evolution needs these 4 as a foundation. As with the 4 powers of the Divine Mother, the 12 attributes also have a natural sequence. Although each is as important as the other in their unfolding, so to say, in their interrelation, there is a natural sequence. And the foundation for everything without exception, the foundation which makes everything else possible, easier, more spontaneous, is this one attribute, this one power, quality, which we call sincerity. We'll explore the full scope of what this means, but as a first step, observe when we describe somebody as insincere. This fellow is insincere, he is not reliable, you cannot trust him, he lies or deceives or does not keep his word. So, unreliable is the sense we have. But that's not it. Because sincerity is not so much what he has in relation to you, but what he has in relation to himself. What you have in relation to yourself. Whether you end up not being reliable to another person or not, finally boils down to whether you are reliable to yourself or not. If you cannot be reliable to yourself, how can you be reliable to others? And so sincerity goes to the core of this whole thing. Am I true to myself, or am I deceiving myself? And so as a first step, you will notice, Mother gives this example. A little child bangs his foot against the door. What's the first reaction? Oh, this door, bam. It's his fault. He happened to be in my way. A little more developed human being, somebody abuses you, you abuse back, hit back, whatever form it takes. You did this, therefore I am justified in what I did. What I did is not nice, but in relation to your action, it is justified. And it's another form of self-deception, slightly more complex, but basically the same thing. Kicking the door and blaming the door. And then it becomes more and more complex as we grow into complexity, where eventually we can justify anything. But if you look more deeply, something in us knows. And there's a part that can actually tell you, this is not really correct. I still have a choice. I still can choose to be different. So we notice the whole question of insincerity happens when there is one part that knows, one part that is not in alignment with what you know. And there is a split, a division, a gap. You deceive yourself, therefore. We mentioned this yesterday, that the greatest capacity of the human intellect is the power of self-deception, where you can justify anything. And one of the problems with this is, once you're habituated to it, it's very difficult to free yourself from the self-deception. There are people who got into it early on, and now it's become a part of their normal way of being, and they're so lost to themselves. They're lying to themselves all the time, they don't even know it. One of the problems with certain types of careers is this. The legal career, for example. A lawyer has to be, the work requires, justify anything that is placed before him. He has to justify the client's actions irrespective of whether they're true or not, right or wrong. And they have to be so convincing that they have to convince the judge of a wrong being right. For that purpose, you cannot convince another unless you convince yourself first. And so, the skill of the successful lawyer is to be so convincing to himself that he feels a righteous indignation when the falsehood is exposed. And this becomes the part of the personality, and you end up with a big mess which is very difficult to extricate from. So as early as we can, if we can begin to recognize where things are mixed and not pretend, not hide from ourselves. But that's not enough. That does not get you back to the point which we would call sincerity. There's something more happening. You can not hide from yourself, but what is yourself? There is a deeper I and a deeper I and a deepest I from which you might still end up hiding, or from which you're still separate. So let's put it another way, we'll use the vocabulary. That which is the most essential you, the divine, already knows everything that's happening within you, right? I'm going to put it another way. In the yogic tradition, we say everything is finally an expression of the divine. Everything is formed out of the very substance and consciousness of the divine. Where is the divine? Not out there in some high heaven, but right here in the very substance, in the very essence of every atom and every object, including my body, including my nervous system, including my brain waves, my emotions, my thoughts. The very essential substance of it all is the divine presence. And so it knows me more intimately than I know myself, isn't it? Can I ever hide something from the divine consciousness? Impossible. I can pretend that I have successfully hidden, and the divine consciousness would still know. And it can pretend as if it has been successfully deceived, just to keep a good relation with you, so that you can feel happy and comfortable. I'm going to take an example here. There was an incident of somebody in the ashram who did something which he knew the mother would not approve. And how can he go to the mother having done this? She will immediately see and chastise him perhaps. So he sat down with great concentration, pushed back the memory and the idea of what he had done, put forward his best. I am this nice little angel person in front. And holding this, went to the mother, and she met him as always with the same love and affection, blessed him, and he went back. I managed to deceive her. And the second day, and the third day, and the fourth day, eventually he tired of it. Something within him was uncomfortable. And then he said, well, I can't continue like this, I have to tell her. So he goes to the mother, and she greets him as usual. And he says, Mother, I'm very sorry, I have to tell you, I have done something very bad and I've been hiding it from you. And very sweetly the mother said, oh, don't worry, I knew it the very first day when you came, it was peeping out from behind you. There's another sweet incident which takes the whole thing in the very different direction. A young student in the ashram school had just completed his education, and he announced to everybody, I am going to go to Germany and study, I think it was physiology or something. And then after that, of course, the word spread, and he said, oops, I have not taken mother's permission. And maybe she will be upset that I didn't take her permission. And as it happened, within an hour, somebody comes to him and says, mother is calling you. Oops. So he goes to the mother, and very sweetly the mother welcomes him and says, sit down, sit down. I hear that you are going to go to Germany. Very nice. And then she pulls out a paper and tells him, you know, when you go to Germany, you cannot appreciate German culture unless you drink German beer. And then she writes down the names of the best German beers and says, you must drink these. And when you're in Germany, you must visit France because it's the cultural center of Europe. And in France, you must appreciate the best French wines. And she writes down the names of the best French wines. You must drink these. Now this man, having lived in Germany for so many decades, when he was narrating the story, he had tears in his eyes. Because you see what she did. He would have eventually had all these things. But what she did was, by telling him to have these, every time that he drinks German beer or French wine, he remembers the mother. Under orders of the mother, he is drinking. And full of gratitude. You see, before he could build up a false sense of guilt, before the guilt could create a separation again, that he has done something which now he needs to hide and pull back from and create a gap, she has bridged it in such a way that at the time which he does the very things which might make him feel guilty, he feels most grateful and is open to the divine. And when we begin to accept that the divine already knows deep within us, we have nothing to hide. We cannot hide from the divine. We can deceive ourselves, but we cannot deceive the divine. And we begin to let go of that effort. And rather than feeling guilty, we accept and open and offer ourselves. This is what it is. There's a very interesting process which sometimes life makes you undergo. An introspection in which you discover that deep within you, you have pretty much everything that you criticize in everyone else. And if you've ever been through that experience, you realize there's no point criticizing anyone. You have it anyway. That's the nature of the human substance. And there's nothing to be ashamed about it. That's our starting point. That's the basis with which we begin. This is the tissue we've taken on, which we want to change, to transform, to divinize. And you don't have to be guilty about it being, well, dark, dull, having all these weird distortions. Rather, work at it to purify it. And if you cannot, well, open it to the divine consciousness and say, here, this, help me. You fill it, you purify it, you transform it. Free me from this distortion. And so, in the process of developing our sincerity, if we have aligned ourselves to the divine consciousness and opened ourselves, the way becomes very easy. But it's not yet sincerity. Sincerity is when there is no gap within you anywhere and all the different pieces in you are no more working at cross purposes. It means now you have to start aligning all these pieces around and unifying them. Now consider, we are made up of so many parts, so many tendencies, so many impulses. Each is going in its own direction. Around what will you unify them? If you unify them around where you are right now, there's always a part which is your higher part. And there'll be a gap there, vertically, so to say. So the only way you can have a true unification is if you unify around your highest developed awareness. Okay? So now the mother defines sincerity in this way. Sincerity means to lift all the movements of the being to the level of the highest consciousness and realization already attained. Very simple. Lift all the parts of the being to the level of the highest realization or consciousness already attained. And implied in this is this unification and harmonization. So the next paragraph she says, sincerity exacts the unification and harmonization of the whole being in all its parts and movements around the central divine will. Now, I'm not conscious of the central divine will, but whatever the highest I'm aware of, whatever deepest, truest part of me that I'm aware of, just that. What it means practically is, everything you do at all times, in all parts of your nature, is in relation to your highest, deepest, truest you. Okay, now the sense of sincerity is pretty simple. There's some part of you that is your truest and highest real you that you're aware of, whatever it is, and it will grow, it will deepen, no problem. But what it is now, that becomes the leader, and around that everything else is put in reference and lifted, if possible, and aligned to it. Now notice what happens with this. All your actions are in alignment with your feelings, which are in alignment with your thoughts, which are in alignment with your speech. Obviously, because everything is aligned around one highest or deepest center. So there is thinking, speech, feeling, action, all in a single alignment. Imagine what it does to you, what it does to you, what it does to your actions and speech, what it does to the relations you have with people. You can see the sense of integrity that grows. You can trust yourself, and naturally people, circumstances can begin to trust you equally. And when that happens, you can see the chain reaction that follows. If there's somebody you know that you can trust, if he says something, he will do it. If he means it, he does not deceive himself, he does not deceive you. What happens then? You build on that trust. I'm going to put it in the context of business because so many of you are in that space. If you observe the nature of business, ultimately, no transaction is possible if there is no trust. All transactions are based on some basic trust. You make contracts, you put bank guarantees and other devices, but even those are based on trust. That eventually you will stick to the contract that is signed, that the system will stand by your contract, that the bank can be trusted. There's always an implied trust, isn't it? Very often when you make a contract, the contract is incidental. If you do not trust the person, you would never take it to the level of contract. Because you trust the person, you're going ahead even with the deal. The contract is there as a backup. If circumstances cause a failure of trust, then that's your backup you fall back on. Isn't it? In the old days, in the Indian business communities, the level of trust was often so deep that if you gave your word, that was enough, it was equivalent to a contract. And by old days, I mean even if you go back 50 years. In some communities, even today, it's like that in India. And some of you are from those communities, and you practice these values even here in the USA. And where that is, where that level of trust is built up, you see how quickly the businesses move forward, how quickly we can collaborate and develop possibilities. Sincerity in a collective space makes for smooth, rapid growth. If at each point you have to question and doubt, what are all the ways in which I can distrust? What are all the ways in which the person may deceive? Nothing will ever happen. And sometimes it's not that the person intends to deceive, it's just he never keeps his word. That's how he is. This is the basic difference you will notice for those of you who have straddled these cultures. The basic difference between India today and USA today. Here, when you have made an agreement, things move based on what you have agreed. In India, you have made an agreement, but somehow it's never fulfilled on the other side because there's a delay, because there was a power failure, because there was a strike, because the fellow was in a bad mood, or anything could happen which will delay things. You can't rely on it, and you have to plan for things not working. It makes for a huge complication and delay. So in the collective space, the trust becomes the base for rapid, cohesive, organized, harmonized activity. But exactly the same thing takes place inside us. When the different parts are within us aligned, dependable, trustworthy, then your internal growth, your personality and its forward movement or its action is cohesive, laminar flow. Not one thing going at cross purposes with another, upsetting or destabilizing something. You want to do something, your mind, your emotions, your actions are all aligned. When the internal sincerity is not there, there's the gap. My mind wants to do, my emotions don't want to do. My body has a different story of its own, and I'm at cross purposes. And I struggle, I fight against myself to get something done. There's this famous statement, the spirit is willing but the flesh is weak. That's insincerity between different parts. And what happens? You are in an internal battle and struggle. You cannot move. You cannot have a stable forward movement or growth. And so this is the very foundation for any growth, any evolution, any collaboration. Individual, collective, internal, external. How do we put it into practice? The first step is not to deceive oneself and not to deceive the divine. When I went through a certain internal crisis and I discovered that I had been deceiving myself in a pretty serious way in certain matters, and the discovery of that was a bit of a shock. And I realized why I needed to do it. Because to face the fact that within me was this impulse was not a pretty picture. It did not fit my image of myself. I'm supposed to be this really nice, good guy who lives up to the best values, and here within me is this. No, it cannot be. I have to cover it up, to hide it from me. You see how it works? And at some point, life forced me to face certain things, and I said, wow, how did this happen? And one of the resolutions I took at that point was, I may put up any pretense to deceive anybody, but I will not deceive myself. And whatever happens within me, I will accept, okay, this is what it is, and I'll open it to the Divine Mother. Here I am, this is what it is. I'm going to hide it from the rest of the world. I'm going to pretend to be a nice, sweet, angelic being, but this is what it is. I face it and help me. So there are various ways in which each one of us can deal with these types of internal situations, but the first thing is not to deceive oneself and not to deceive the divine. If you get these two steps right, the rest of the thing becomes easy. Now you can begin to align yourself. Again, aligning yourself around your deepest or highest or most true center, whatever it is accessible now, that will change. But when you begin to align yourself, again recognizing that it will not always stay stable. It may change, it may shift, and that's okay. But the attempt itself is your sincerity. And because that is the basis of your sincerity, the attempt itself provokes the stabilization, the help, the change that needs to take place. When, for example, we try not to lie, we try to set ourselves as an example to our children. We tell our children, you should not lie. And then the children watch us doing something on the telephone. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not well, I cannot come. And the child does not follow what you tell him, he follows what you do. When you face that kind of a situation, what can you do? You cannot prevent yourself from lying always, because somehow life always puts it as a sticky challenge. But what you can do is the effort not to lie, the effort not to deceive is your reference for the child. That I try, I may fail, but I make an effort constantly. It's the same with sincerity. The sincerity of your effort is itself your basis on which the integration and harmonization and the completeness of the sincerity will grow. That process may take time, it may be a lifetime even. But an effective sincerity has been established in the very intention and the effort that you make. And this is where we begin. And the mother says the result of this is, whenever there is sincerity, you find that the help, the guidance, the grace are always there to give you the answer. And you are not mistaken for long. It's an interesting thing. If internally you are cohesive, you are not deceiving yourself. When you have a problem, when you don't know what to do, when you have made a mistake and you're not aware of it, very quickly it will get exposed and you will be given the indication and the help. Because you've created a climate in which the help can be effective. If within me I have conflicting parts and the help comes, which part is it going to help? You see the problem? When I'm internally integrated as much as possible, the help comes, well, there is the whole of me that it can help. Equally, when I make a mistake but I'm not aware of it, there is a dissonance in the part where the mistake is sensed with the rest of me, and very quickly it gets exposed. And I know, I'm conscious, I caught the mistake. It will happen that you've written something and it's done, you think it's perfect, but because of the internal integrity, something in you feels odd and something makes you reopen the paper and your fingers or your sight goes right there on that point. Oops, I missed this. And so she says, the help, the guidance, the grace are always there to give you the answer, and you are not mistaken for long. There is another aspect to the sincerity. So sincerity becomes the basis. Without this overall internal integrity, nothing else can happen. When you have this, everything else becomes easy. And the next attribute, the next power that the mother lists is humility. And again, this is something which is an internal poise. It's not so much how you pretend to be externally, but what you feel and experience internally. Humility towards what? There is the biblical tradition that speaks of the meek shall inherit the earth. And so it's interpreted as, okay, those who are weak, who put up a pretense of being humble, they are the ones who will somehow be rewarded for being humble, for being weak, for being meek. It's not so much a question of reward or punishment. Rather, it's a state of consciousness which allows things to happen. So let's look at the sense of humility more deeply. The mother observes there is a wrong humility and there is a right way of humility. The wrong humility is when you have this pretentious humility. There's this interesting example of the disciple who goes to his master and says, "Master, I want to be your humblest disciple." And the master turns around and says, "Oh, even in your humility, you want to be most important." You see how the humility is deceptive in the fake form or the false form of humility. The mother observes that when you have this sense of vanity, you get puffed up, I am so great, I have done. Immediately it creates a block of self-satisfaction. I have reached. There's nothing more for me to do. I am there. And poof, there's a block. The true humility is not about what you appear to others. It's the recognition internally that you are nothing without the divine presence filling you, helping you, working in you. And this recognition that all that you are and all the greatness that you have achieved or that has been achieved through you is done by that presence is enormously liberating. It gives you two things. First, it takes the burden off you. You see, if you were the one who was the great person who's achieved so much, and suddenly you're thrown in a challenging situation, you have to live up to the expectation of your greatness. Wow, that's a huge burden. And you're not going to be able to concentrate. But when you realize that everything that's great in you is actually an action of the divine presence and force and intelligence and strength, you rely on it. I'm nothing. It is there, and there's nothing greater than that. It will do what is necessary. I only try to be as far as possible a transparent instrument to its action. The stress is off. It's not your problem anymore. Second, you are relying on something which is so much greater than you that your incapacity is irrelevant. It has the capacity to give you the capacity. There is in Adi Shankaracharya's famous verse, he says that it is the divine grace can make the lame to climb the mountains and the mute to be able to speak. That's the grace on which you're relying. In what is presented today as the national song of India, Vande Mataram, which was the mantra, Sri Aurobindo says, given for India's freedom. It is an invocation to the Divine Mother as embodied as Mother India. Okay? And in that invocation, somewhere it says, in my arms, you are the strength. In my heart, you are the devotion. In my mind, you are the intelligence. It is your image that is established in temple and temple. And the temple here is not the outer temple, it is the internal temple. The divine presence is the strength in your arms, is the intelligence in your head, is the love and devotion in your heart. And it is the divine image, his, her, whatever form you relate to, that is established in the temple that is your whole being. And one begins to orient oneself in this direction. You realize everything you are, everything you have is a gift and a grace. And you have this deep, true humility, which makes you a transparent instrument for that action. And all the rest becomes spontaneous and natural. When in the middle of this process, something in me pops up and says, I am intelligent, this is my strength, this is my capacity, you can see how it acts like a dam in the flow of that knowledge or strength. And poof, there's a block, and suddenly things go wrong. As a result of this humility, as a result of this recognition that everything you are is a gift of the divine, there is also the third power that emerges, gratitude. You feel so utterly grateful to the divine presence within you, in everything. The fact that everything is filled with the divine presence makes life worthwhile, and there is this enormous gratitude. And the mother puts it this way, that kind of sense of gratitude that the divine exists, that feeling of a marveling thankfulness which truly fills you with a sublime joy at the fact that the divine exists, that there is something in the universe which is divine, that it is not just the monstrosity that we see. And each time that the least thing puts you either directly or indirectly in contact with this reality of the divine existence, your heart is filled with so intense, so marvelous a joy. This movement of gratitude naturally becomes a movement of self-giving. When you're grateful, what do you experience? You give yourself in gratitude. In fact, the mother says, it's a vibration of love that appears in this. That is the essence of this. So she says, When you enter this vibration in its purity, you realize immediately that it has the same quality as the vibration of love. It is directionless. Ultimately, gratitude is only a very slightly colored shade of the essential vibration of love. But what is this thing that we call love? You see, essentially, love is a movement of self-giving leading to what? To a merging, to an identification with that which you love. And so when you feel this gratitude with the Divine Presence, you have this spontaneous opening of the heart and mind and a merging, a self-giving into the Divine Presence. Practically what it does, it thins your ego, it thins the barriers of your separateness, of your narrowness, of your incapacity, of your ignorance. What is ego? The self-defined limits into which you are bound. The fact that you're bound in it makes for your incapacity because you have limited energy. Makes for your ignorance because you have limited knowledge. And the thinning of the ego spontaneously begins, and with it comes the opening to a wider knowledge, greater strength, greater capacity. All of us have had this experience. When you do something for yourself, you have only a limited energy. You can only go so far. But when you do something for others, you find you can do so much more. Not only you have greater energy, greater capacity, you can go on for longer, and you have greater satisfaction. Why? Because you just widened out of the narrowness of your petty limits. Your ego sense broadened a little bit. And with this gratitude, there is the thinning of the ego and all the rest that follows. Effectively, one becomes more and more a transparent instrument for a greater power to act through us. You see, the first three that we have described have effectively integrated, raised to the highest, unified, harmonized, and dissolved barriers and limits and opened out to transparency to the divine intelligence, strength, power, love. With it comes a joy. And you can see why these are three foundations. And the fourth foundation is when all of this is no more momentary, when it continues more and more for longer and longer. And so the fourth power is perseverance. Now each of these we're describing individually, but equally they apply collectively. Collectively as a team, we feel so grateful. We feel so grateful that we've been able to do all this, that we've been given this opportunity to take up this project, to make something beautiful, to realize a dream. And there's a shared poise of transparency and self-giving, which makes for a collective instrument which forms. And so in the same way, the perseverance also can be individual as well as collective. The mother describes this thus: the most essential quality is perseverance, endurance, a kind of an inner good humor which helps you not to get discouraged, not to become sad, to face all difficulties with a smile. And she uses the word cheerfulness. To be cheerful in spite of resistances, difficulties, and so on. She says there are people who fall very quickly into despair, that, oh, I've tried so much, I've done so much work, and now everything is gone, I have to start again. And she says, no, you should be willing to. You should be willing to start again and again. In the context of the integral yoga, which involves particularly this aspect of transformation of our nature, which is, well, difficult. The inner awakening is not so difficult. It is the transformation of the nature which is more difficult. But of this, Sri Aurobindo says, one has to act as if, I'm trying to get the exact phrasing, one has to act as if I don't get the exact phrasing, but I summarize. You have to act as if you have all the time in the world, but right now, everything must be done as soon as possible. There's this extreme focus of all your energies and capacities on the moment, in this action. As far as results are concerned, it can take all the time that it wants. And that's the attitude with which one begins any work, any project. There's something very interesting that happens when you concentrate yourself in this way. You forget yourself. And when you forget yourself, you will find things happen smoothly, spontaneously. You enter a kind of a state of zone. This is a vocabulary which is now more common in the new age. You are in the zone, which means what? Somehow it just happens. Things just flow. Things happen magically, effortlessly. Often this happens during states of crisis, when collectively we are together to survive, and suddenly everybody puts their best because it's survival. You forget yourself. And things just happen, things just flow. We are all attuned somehow on some level. And then the crisis goes away, and everybody falls back to their separateness of individuality. The same happens when you have an urgent assignment to finish. You have just 2 hours and the work requires 6 hours. Well, you put yourself in so intensely that you forget yourself and somehow you manage to finish in 2 hours. And there's a great joy in that state. When you've forgotten yourself entirely, something happens which is almost magical, a high which nothing else can equal. And there you get a first glimpse of what it's like to be without ego. Because you've forgotten yourself. No more you doing, it's being done almost through you. So this can be cultivated individually as well as collectively. And in this particular case, in the context of endurance, you're able to endure when you align yourself like this. Because you're no more thinking of what will happen. You're entirely focused on what you're doing. The outcomes, whatever they are. The result is you can go on, you can keep at it, and you have the joy of it all through. There is an aspect to this which Sri Krishna describes in the Bhagavad Gita. He says that in terms of action, practically, what is it that's in your control? The effort that you make. But the outcome is not in your control, it's dependent on so many other things. It depends on whether others will do what they do, how well they do or not do. Just take an example, one of the biggest problems we have when we are competing with others. We have a high stress because we don't know whether we will manage to get first or second or third or last. But if you think about it, the best of your effort will still not guarantee that you will come first or last. It depends on how well others do. I sometimes tell this to students. You want to come first? Fine, compete with the kindergarten child, you'll come first. What's the big deal? Will you be satisfied with it? No. You want to come last, compete with somebody who's three steps ahead in your school. 3 classes ahead, you will come last. But if you don't come last and actually come somewhere in between, what a deep satisfaction you'll have. You've competed with the best and learned so much, perhaps, in the process. So Mother used to say this. She said as a young person, she never found it interesting to play tennis with people of her own capacity. She would always want to compete with the best people, always losing. But those were the most interesting learning experiences. That's when she grew the most, because she was playing with the best. What's the point of competing with people that you have nothing to learn from? Isn't it? So when you start thinking differently, the whole perspective changes. You do not worry about the outcome. Will it succeed or not? You concern yourself only with your effort. And the Gita says, specifically, Sri Krishna says in the Gita, you have right only upon your action and your effort. never upon the fruits of your effort. That's never your concern or your responsibility. And it's easy to give that up. Okay, whatever the outcome, here I offer it to you. Free myself, free me from it. Now I do my best. And having done your best, even if the outcome is not commensurate to whatever somebody's expectation is, you have done your best and you have the full satisfaction of it. But something else happens, because at that point you've offered the result and you're making an effort in a concentration. Your effort is filled with that sense of consecration, opening the way, and if the first 3 steps have also been developed, you feel yourself almost like a channel through which the divine strength and wisdom within you is activated and working in the zone. And in such a state you can endure and go through to whatever extent required. Perseverance is no more a labor when you are thus aligned. But what is the benefit of perseverance, the mother says, because inevitably life will throw difficulties along the way. She says, one who perseveres is sure to triumph. Victory goes to the most enduring. Always do your best, and the Lord will take care of the results. And she says, it is by persevering that one conquers difficulties, not by running away from them. This idea that, she puts it differently elsewhere, the victory is for the most enduring. One must find one's certitude within oneself, keep it in spite of everything, and go one's way, whatever the cost, to the very end. The victory is for the most enduring. And the question here is, enduring against what and for what? Against resistance, against opposition, against challenges. But for what are you doing this? What is it that you're aiming to do? What is it that you're enduring for? And once you become clear of this, the rest becomes easy. If what you're working for is something worthwhile, and you've given yourself to that goal, to that ideal, to that project, which is so dear to you, which is worth realizing, and you commit yourself to it, you change your perspective. It's not just for me, it is worthwhile for humanity. Let's say you're building the most beautiful hotel. You're building a new invention. You're making a software which will be different, which will serve something. Keep in mind that it is going to be not just you, not just for you, but for a larger purpose that it will serve. Its presence in the world will change for so many people, circumstances, isn't it? And when you keep that big picture in mind, you commit to its realization. You're not doing it just for yourself. It's worth doing. And that allows you to then persist in spite of opposition and difficulties. There are things which are less important, almost trivial, where you may not find the same endurance. There are other things which are so important that the fate of the earth rests upon it. You don't have a choice, you will endure, isn't it? And so somewhere in between is this effort that you make. These four make for the foundation. Upon this foundation, what is it that makes possible the realization of the goal? This is the next 4 of the powers. First among them is aspiration. Aspiration is what aligns the direction. Receptivity, progress, and courage. And these 4 we will take up in the next discussion. For now, having looked at the first 4, which lay the foundation for any growth and evolution, we can pause and take up a few questions and for discussion.
So during meditation, sometimes we see different colors, green or blue. Are they the same colors from the mother symbol, or do they mean anything else?
It depends, because there are many kinds of seeing. The question was about seeing colors in meditation and whether they relate to the symbols colors. They may not. It depends on the seeing. But there are many kinds of seeing. There is the seeing which is of the physical sight. A lot of people close their eyes and then they're looking at patterns of red and blue, which is typically what you see with the eyelids closed. It's a physical color, a physical image. Often purple, violet, and sometimes it seems to move. It's interesting. But by itself, it won't lead to anything worthwhile unless your attention is on something which is deeper. You can watch many colors for a long time. It's psychedelic even, but by itself may serve no purpose. There's an inner sight, and the inner sight may see colors also and things. But again, of which level, of which domain? If you look at colors around a person's aura, okay, so what? At best, it helps you to make a diagnosis of their internal state, but it doesn't change your consciousness. There's a very different order of experience where you enter a different state of consciousness, which may be associated with a certain color of light or feeling. When, for example, when deep in the presence of the psychic being, there's a particular vibration which is associated with that, which may reflect in your consciousness as a color. And then the color is incidental to the purity of the feel of the vibe. In the inner domains, form is secondary. The vibe, the feel is what comes first. So my suggestion would be for you not to focus on colors, but the feel that you have in the concentration. Focus on the sense of the devotion or the love for the divine, or the sense of the closeness or intimacy with the divine consciousness, or the sense of the peace or the stillness or joy that comes with that closeness with the divine consciousness. Colors, forms, images are not so important. It is these things growing which will make the meditation worthwhile, because it will change your consciousness.
These four attributes, the foundation, in terms of perseverance and endurance, it seems to me that it is said in the light of the first three that perseverance and endurance is required to make those things more complete,
Exactly.
regardless of what other activities you may be doing. Yes. But deep down, those three need to be perfected, and that's where the perseverance and endurance are required.
Absolutely. Well, that's one. Yes, it is true. It's not the only thing. So the perseverance you can see in terms of the effort that you make for the sincerity and in the growth of the humility and gratitude. You persevere in the sincerity because the integration is a long process, as we saw. That's an internal perseverance. But equally, there may be an external form of the perseverance where you persist in an effort that is being made externally. But always the principle is what you're able to develop internally is what you can achieve externally. If you cannot persevere in an internal effort, you will never be able to persevere in an external effort.
The second comment or second observation is that the first three are intimately linked. They are not so distinct as you can say 1, 2, 3, 4. Humility and gratitude has to go together. You can't say, well, I'm extremely in humility but not thankful. You can't have it. Both has to go together.
You will see there's a natural consequence.
Yes.
With the sincerity, there is the leading to the humility, which leads to the gratitude, and the perseverance is like an underlying support for all three. Yes, there's a deep connection between them, but they are very distinct in the experience subjectively. Especially when you turn them externally, objectively, then the distinction becomes even more separate. So, for example, it can take the form, let's say you have an opportunity now. You've worked to develop this possibility, you've got this contract, you've won an opportunity to do something. the sense of gratitude that you have an opportunity to do something worthwhile. That gives to the whole effort, to the work, the sense of sacredness. And in the very act of it becoming sacred, it becomes totally worthwhile. And these are things which are so distinctly felt. The humility is felt. Without the divine help, nothing can be done in this. And the divine help is there with me. And so with it comes the enormous confidence and strength that you can persevere, you will overcome in spite of all difficulties. Because it's the divine help, not your strength, with which the work is taken up. You'll see these flow into each other, but the form of it is so distinct. Yes.
In one of your DVDs, a student asks you, I think the student was doing very badly in school and knows the parents would be very upset. I hope I got this right. You said to the student, go to your grandmother, she will tell you persevere, you can do it. Is that what you said?
I don't know if it was that, but the way I've used that example of grandmother is, you see, in the US, it is now almost fashionable or compulsory to visit a therapist for anything. I'm upset, I'm unhappy, things didn't go right, I need therapy. Okay? In India, that's a strange concept. Because in India, we have grandmothers. We go to grandma, put our head on her lap and say, I'm feeling miserable. And she says, don't worry, babe, my child, everything will be fine. That's therapy. That's really what the therapist is doing to you, you know. And they just make you pay a little for it. You pay their rent so that they can give you that.
Well, it doesn't really pay when the student's upset and goes home to the mother and father and then make it worse. They tell them, you know, you're stupid, you're bad, and why can't you do better? I don't think
that's why I said grandma, not parents. Parents are anxious and they think that by goading you, you will do better. Grandma is not anxious. She knows that you'll manage it. She knows there's something deeper. And if parents could be like grandparents, it would be much simpler.
In the beginning, you mentioned that there is a divine all around you, even within your body. So why the divine doesn't act as a divine when something goes wrong with it?
It's a very important question. If the divine is already within the strength and intelligence within me, why doesn't it always act when things go wrong? In fact, it's always acting. But there are two levels of its action. You see, the strength in my arms, where does the energy come from? You can say at a very physical level, it's the food I ate which gives it. Yes, but what makes for that food's energy to fill and work effectively? You know, eventually if you keep asking, but where does that come from? Where does that come from? Eventually you realize all energy is divine energy. All intelligence is part of a larger intelligence. But in its current working, there is a lower grade of working, which is almost mechanical. And that was especially necessary in the early parts of evolution, where animal life is driven automatically with a deep intelligence and a deep skill. See, a weaver bird, if you've ever observed a weaver bird, it can weave a nest from a branch. It'll form loops of leaves or fibers and then weave into that such complex nest with an opening on top through which you enter and there's a pocket. Does it know it's constructing that when it starts? Does it know it's going to lay an egg inside? It doesn't know consciously. It feels an instinct, it just does it. I observed once in my house, there was a nest which had been built like this. Unfortunately, it was on a low branch and one night we discovered the cat had taken it. And the bird came again and again looking for its nest. It didn't find, it was unhappy, it was sad. It went away. After 2 weeks it came and the few fibers which were left on the branch, it began to remove them. After 2 weeks. Why? That was the instinct. After the child is born, after the baby has flown out of the nest, it must undo the nest. but the baby never had a chance to grow and fly out. But the instinct continued to finish the work. You see? It's not thinking conscious of what it has to do or why it's doing, and yet the perfect skill with which it does it. Try to do with 2 fingers to build that nest. It has a beak. Try to do it with 2 fingers. You can't. And yet nobody taught it. It didn't go to school. It didn't get a certificate for that skill. It's their inbuilt instinct. That's intelligence. That is will. Working with such great skill, but subconscious, unknown to the conscious mind. Now, as a human being, we have emerged out of this evolution. We have developed a conscious mind, but this underlying skill and intelligence, the lower grade of working, is there still. And if somehow we are able to tap into that, even we can do those kinds of extraordinary things when you're in the zone. But the conscious mind is the resistance. It becomes self-conscious. Oops, what am I doing? Am I doing right? And it takes control from what would be the instinct. If you allowed the instinct to work, it would be perfect. Unerring is the instinct in nature. Conscious mind takes control back, and it doesn't have the capacity. Now, the goal for us is not to go back to the instinct. The goal of separating from instinct is precisely to rise above instinct and open to a still higher working of the same intelligence, revealed, conscious, and that we call intuition. The conscious action of this knowledge is intuition. The subconscious action of the same knowledge is instinct. What's the difference? Aurobindo explains like this. In instinct, the impulse comes first, the knowledge is hiding. You don't know why, you just have to do it and you do it. That's the bird weaving. In intuition, the knowledge is first. You know what it is, you know what you have to do, and the impulse flows from the knowledge. It's revealed, not hidden, not subconscious, superconscious. So in between, the passage from the instinct to intuition requires disengaging and then re-engaging on a conscious level to that higher, freer, open working of the divine knowledge and strength. And so we are in this in-between stage. But in the in-between stage, you say, I will do, and you can only do so much. When you say, I will be an instrument to the higher doing, and you consciously open to that knowledge, then the whole thing flows. Yes.
How can we consciously identify and acknowledge our shortcomings, like laziness or impatience or anger? Because even when we are shown already, ego doesn't acknowledge it. So, how do we consciously identify?
So when you say, okay, the question is when you have laziness or other shortcomings, you do not consciously acknowledge it. How can we do that? Because the ego does not do it consciously. Well, the question I'll ask is, why doesn't it do consciously? Because it's not comfortable recognizing some incapacity, isn't it? Because it does not fit your self-image, which is, I am perfect, I can never be wrong. It's always someone else's fault. And you have to break that. Start by recognizing we are all in it together. All of us share the substance of human nature. Same kinds of problems, different forms, different specializations of problem types. I have laziness, somebody has hyperactivity. They're just 2 different extremes of undeveloped or imbalance. No big deal. Within me, equally, I could have gone this way or that. And you don't need to think out what's wrong with me. You could make a list of 1,000 things. That doesn't help. Rather, life will throw at you situations which will force you to recognize something is not working here. What's the problem? You turn in, observe, and you notice, this is where I have a resistance, this is where I have a fear, this is where I have a problem. Okay, so I have a problem here. What do I do next? You deal with it practically. The error is to identify with the problem and therefore the need to protect it. You stand back from the problem as if it's a design defect of the spacesuit that you have put on. You see, if the spacesuit has a problem, you won't say, I am right. You'll say, my spacesuit has a defect. I must approach the manufacturer, right? Because you are not spacesuit. So you treat the body as something you've taken on as an instrument. Okay, there's a problem, there's a laziness here. The same with your emotions, the same with your thinking also. These are all layers as instruments that you've taken on through which you act in the world. And if there's a problem, you stand back and say, okay, what do I do about it? Once you accept this poise, the rest becomes easy. Yes.
Do we have the signs of suggestion or say self-talk? No, audible?
I didn't get it.
We have the signs of suggestion, self-talk, wherein they say that, for example, somebody has problem of say anger. So they say if I'm writing a self-talk for myself and I'm not supposed to express any positive suggestion to reinforce the fact that okay, this person, like, I get angry. So the self-talk is it's like an imagination of the ideal situation which would exist when there's like a source anger. So in that case, at some level you have to accept that yes, anger exists, right? And that is when you reach to the position of self-talk. But that level at which you are accepting any shortcoming itself is a suggestion, like you are reinforcing, yes, you do have this problem.
Yes.
And that's where the ego shrinks. Why do I even step forward to accept this at all? Why not jump directly to self-talk, somewhere subconsciously accepting?
So as a first step, you recognize that here is an issue. Okay, the question is a bit complex. She's referring to a kind of a therapy which is called self-talk, where you have to write out something, but which focuses on the ideal, not repeating the problem that you have, ignoring the problem, but focusing what must be. So really what this does is, this focuses on the means by which you overcome. First step, you have to recognize you have an issue here. You don't have to call it a problem, don't worry. There's something here which needs evolution, which needs growth. We're all starting from somewhere, we need to take one step forward. No big deal, no one's to blame. It's not a crime. Okay, it's just an opportunity now. Here, I need to develop this. It's a great opportunity. Now, how do you develop it? To get free from example of laziness or anger or jealousy, it won't help to tell yourself, oh, I'm jealous, oh, I'm angry, oh, I'm lazy. That's not going to help. What is it that you want to get to? You focus on that. Put your attention on the state of consciousness which you want to develop and inculcate within you. What you put attention on grows. If you put attention on a weakness, the weakness gets exaggerated. If you put attention on a strength, that grows. So rather than saying, I have anger and I have to resist and fight my anger, which will only worsen things, what is it you want to do? You want to feel compassion to all. Well, start feeling compassion. Turn your attention to increasing compassion. The anger will fade on its own. You see, what is the jealousy? What do you want to do? You focus on that. If you look deeply at the nature of any of these distortions, they are really essentially something positive which has got warped or bound or off track. What is jealousy? When you look at somebody and you feel jealous that they can do this, they have this and I don't have. It's a warped expression of a deep truth. If they can do it, I also should be able to do it. Looking at them, I feel inspired to want to do it, to be like that. That movement of looking at a great example and being inspired gets warped or perverted when I need to defend myself. Oh, they have it, but I don't. And so the perversion comes. Instead, if I undo that distortion, oh wow, it's possible. If they can do, I also. And it becomes an inspiring act. The same with anger. What are you trying to do when you get angry? I have told you so many times, why don't you? You're trying to assert energy, assert force to break through some kind of resistance which you don't know how to handle. Anger is an attempt to exercise power over someone or a situation which you feel helpless against. You've given up almost. And you throw out that energy in a burst. Instead, you channel that energy, focus it. What is it you need to do? Step back from the impulse of anger, rationalize, think, and then redirect the energy in a way that is constructive. So every distortion you will find can be, so to say, deconstructed and a positive seed found or direction set by which you undo the distortion and you have something which is true. That's one way of doing. The other way is simply focus on the new rhythm or new state that you want and you just work on developing it. It replaces the old.
How about standing back attitude, which Mother Sraddhalu attitude, any whatever is the problem that you just stand back. But practically it may or may not work because you're dealing with people. I mean, you're in your community. But how do you, how can we use standing back or dissociating?
Question is how to use the poise of standing back or dissociating from the situation. You see, in the way we described it now, it was already implied. When you treat your body, your emotions, and even your mind as an instrument, you have already stood back. When you see an issue to be worked upon, you have already separated yourself from it. It's an issue you are working upon, right? When you identify with it, then you have all these problems. And you don't know how to manage it. I get angry, I can't help it. When anger comes, I am possessed by anger, I cannot control myself. Why? Because you're already one with the movement of anger. When you step back from your emotions and you cultivate this poise of viewing your emotions as tools, an instrument of a part of your being, you've already taken the poise of standing back. You see a problem, all right, let me work to reorganize this, rearrange, modify, develop. That makes the whole process much easier. Because you are not identified with the problem, you can change it. If you're riding a bicycle and the bicycle has a problem, to repair it while you're riding is difficult. You get down from it, step back, and then work upon it. That's easy. Yeah? Something like that. Yes.
Coming back to the other symbol, we have the center, the 4 petals, and the 12 petals. And I'm trying to understand the relation between the 4 petals and these outer 12 petals. For example, Maheshwari, is it connected with all 12 petals? And if it is so, can you explain a little bit more? For example, how Sincerity and Maheshwari, what's the relationship? And so on.
In the way it is drawn, at least, I don't see a direct match between the 4 and the 12 in the pattern. Maybe it can be looked at, but at least it's not obvious. What is obvious is that each of these 12 are more closely aligned to one or the other of the 4. The aspect, for example, of courage is more obviously seen with the Mahakali aspect. Perseverance, similarly, more obviously with the Mahakali aspect. Whereas the gratitude and the humility will be more spontaneously felt in the Mahalakshmi aspect. So one may see certain correspondences, but I'm not sure that there is a particular geometric pattern that links the 4 to the 12. Yes?
This is last question.
You just mentioned that when you don't identify yourself with the problem, it's easier to solve that. So I'm going to cite a personal example of mine. I'm right now working on a very chronic back pain. How can I not identify myself with that? I mean, I would love to learn how to dissociate myself with that physical pain.
She had a pain for many, many years.
I can talk to you. I had a very bad back pain for years. And I took pills and I went to the doctors. I come here, my pain is gone. Today. Something happened, and you told me not to go look for it. Maybe I'll find it again. It's something I went through that gave me the back pain. Maybe I can say to people, you're a pain in the back. I don't know. See that? I don't know. But if you just let it go, and I'm sitting here, I know there is a little bit of a pain. I have nothing like I had before. I didn't want to talk about it because people think I'm crazy. My pain is gone.
So the
Don't
question,
find it. Don't
look for it.
Yeah.
the question was how to dissociate from a point of pain. I'll give you a couple of examples. When I was 12 years old, I was soldering something and I burnt my finger on the soldering iron. It burnt like crazy, swollen. Put it in ice. I took it out. After a while, again, the pain came back. I put it in ice, took it out, it came back. Finally, I rationalized the whole thing to myself. Now, there are many approaches. This is one. I said to myself, okay, the burnt part is burnt anyway. It's not going to burn more. Okay? 15 minutes have passed in the ice. And what is the pain sensation? Except some nervous sensations, electricity passing through the nervous system. That's all that the pain represents. It has no other value. Right? You see, in my mind, I'm disentangling myself from the pain. This is only electrical signals. And I say, what happens if I just let it continue? I know it won't burn my finger. I know there'll be no further damage. All I'll have is electricity playing around inside the nerves. Okay, let's see how far it goes. I see, at this point, I've disengaged myself enough. I said, okay, let's sit, watch. And the pain grew and pulsated and throbbed and boom, 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 boom. It increased until it felt as if the finger would burst. And I'm telling myself, okay, this is just electricity. There's nothing going to happen physically. So that's how I kept the poise of separation. And then suddenly, poof, it vanished. That's it, never came back. No, the pain vanished. That's it. And the blister took time to heal, but I never had pain after that. I never had to put it in cold, nothing at all, no plaster. Interesting experience. But if you allow, if you separate yourself from it, you can do things to it. Now, this was one way, it's not the only way. The better way would be invoke peace and light upon it. Now, in this case, you had this experience because here the space is so charged with that presence. Being in it, you soak it up and it does things. It can heal you. But you can consciously invoke it on that point, invoke the peace. But to do that, you must separate yourself in order to. If it's in your back, if you say, my back, you made it yours. My pain, you made it yours. My anger, you made it yours. My problem, you made it yours. You separate, not my problem, not my anger. There is an anger tendency in my emotions. Objectify it. There is a problem happening in this situation. Objectify, separate. And at that point, you can ask for help. The most effective intervention is to invoke help from that which is greater even than you, which can harmonize everything. The power of the divine consciousness which heals. And what is the pain? What is the illness? Disharmony. You bring harmony, gone. And sometimes instantly, sometimes taking a little longer, depending on your receptivity and other factors.